Okay, so now we are in chapter 15, talking about civil liberties, or as the textbook points out, it is the struggle for freedom. And in this first set of discussion points, this lecture, we're going to think about some definitions and core struggles that are related to the idea of civil liberties. And one of the first one we're going to start with is the distinction between civil liberties and civil rights. And we're going to split them apart because I think splitting them apart is an important way of identifying the ways in which both are important. As we know from the democracy standard, civil liberties is talking about political freedoms and civil rights is talking about political equality. But at the same time, we also talked about the fact that there are some key trade-offs between and among the three components of the democracy standard. The ways in which civil liberties and civil rights are different from one another, and as we're going to say in a few moments, demand certain things from our political system is a useful way of thinking about this. But one reminder is that even though we can split them apart theoretically and help us think about some of the ways in which civil liberties and civil rights are not exactly the same thing, we do have to recognize that they are linked together in some important ways, and we want to think about what those are as well. We don't want to lose that point. And the biggest one is that civil rights has been a history of trying to find ways of extending basic individual liberties to certain groups in society, certain groups who have not had access to power, have not had the economic power or social power. And so in many ways, when we talk about civil rights, they are encompassing the idea of civil liberties as well. But at the same time, we do want to point out the ways in which they might be different from one another. And so one way of doing that is introduce a couple of ways of thinking about the distinctions between civil liberties and civil rights. One is more of a way of just memorizing the differences, and that would be to argue along the lines of saying that civil liberties are about freedom and civil rights are about equality. And freedom and equality, as we just said, can be linked to one another, but they can also be very different from one another. But perhaps another way of look even deeper or to introduce another set of terms as a way to think about the distinctions. And that is this idea of negative rights versus positive rights. And so negative rights are going to be associated with the idea of civil liberties or with freedom, and positive rights are going to be linked together with the idea of civil rights and equality. Negative rights are those rights that exist without any government taken by. So in this sense, the idea of negative and positive is not really a normative statement. It's not saying negative rights are things we don't like and positive rights are things that we do like. And as we're going to be talking about, in fact, positive rights have a lot of critics. There are many people who argue that positive rights, the idea of equality, the idea of civil rights, actually demands so much from the government and may take away some individual freedoms from people that it's not worth pursuing, or at least not pursuing through government action. So in this sense, negative and positive rights are not a normative statement. They are instead a way for us to think about what is the role of government in achieving these things. And according to this theory, negative rights are those that exist without any action taken by the government. A little bit further, and you don't want to push it too far, but the idea is that if you're talking about negative rights, those are rights that exist in a vacuum. That we have those, and the only thing that the government can do is to take away those freedoms from us. And so many people who are libertarians in their ideological focus, those who are libertarians are those who believe that freedom is the answer for pretty much. Also believe that the government that governs best is that which governs least, that they do not want much government intrusion. The best way for people to understand what they want is to be able just to allow them to have their freedoms to pursue what their own happiness is. And so the idea of negative rights is this idea of saying that the government doesn't need to take any action for them to occur. Positive rights, on the other hand, are those that exist only if the government takes action to ensure that these rights exist for all people in society. It's an argument that says that the inequalities that are created by any society through history, through economic domination, social domination, discrimination, etc., that all of those inequalities are built into a number of institutions, religious institutions, social institutions, economic institutions, and it takes a powerful entity like the government to come in and break open into inequality. And so in that sense, the role of the government is much more is higher in a system where you have positive rights when that government is going to be trying to achieve ideas of equality. And as we're going to be seeing in chapter 16, when we talk about civil rights specifically, we're going to see that, in fact, the framers of the US Constitution didn't really care about equality. We actually recognize that as well. We've seen that because, as we've talked about, the Constitution only existed if certain compromises were made, and one of those major compromises is to allow slavery to exist. The Three-Fifths Compromise was not about granting any rights to slaves, just thinking about if you're going to have a House of Representatives that is based on population, you needed to figure out how to count the slaves. And so in that sense, slavery is essential to the way in which the US Constitution was set up. And so equality was really not one that was all that important, as well as women weren't given the right to vote, that there were property requirements in order to vote in a number of states, etc. And we're going to talk about that specifically when we talk about chapter 16, which talks about the idea of civil rights and the ideas of equality and the ways in which we attempted to do it. But for now, what we want to do is to say there can be a useful distinction between this idea of civil liberties, which are about freedom, and this idea about civil rights, which is about equality. And another way of looking at this is to point out that, and this is something that's fun that you might be able to do at a dinner party, out to people that most of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments US Constitution, most of the Bill of Rights are more accurately described as the Bill of Liberties, because if you go through the Bill of Rights, you will see that most of those are freedoms. And so we can go ahead and do that just as an example. So if you take the First Amendment, freedom of petition, assembly, and freedom of the press, all of those are, we say that they're freedoms, but the other way of looking at this is to say again that they're negative rights, that the government doesn't need to do anything in order for that to occur, that separate from government stopping those things from happening, we have to say whatever you want until the government says you can't. You are free to publish, if you are a newspaper, whatever you want until the government puts in libel laws and slander laws and other restrictions to publish. You have freedom of religion until the government says that some religions will be preferred over others. And it's not just the First Amendment to the US Constitution. If you go through to take a look at the Third Amendment, which said that there will not be any soldiers put into your house during peacetime. That's the Third Amendment to the US Constitution. That one is clearly a civil liberty because separate government putting those soldiers into your house during peacetime. There are no soldiers in your house unless you invite them in. The Fourth Amendment, protection against illegal search and seizure, is also a civil liberty because it is a negative right. The government doesn't do anything. Without the government coming in and doing illegal search, there is no illegal search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment right of saying that you do not have to have any self-incrimination, that the government must put a case together against you, is a civil liberty. The Eighth Amendment, protection against cruel and unusual punishment, again, unless the government comes in and actually institutes and imposes cruel and unusual punishment, we don't have cruel and unusual punishment. So if you go through most of the Bill of Rights, we could say instead that it should be called the Bill of Liberties because they are all about freedom. Negative rights. The government doesn't need to do anything to make sure that it happens. To civil rights, we can talk about the idea of what in the Bill of Rights might actually include civil rights. One that's the Sixth Amendment right to a speedy trial. The Sixth Amendment right to a speedy trial demands action by the government. There is no system of a legal system until the government comes in and actually creates that. And so in that sense, the idea of that aspect of the Bill of Rights, the Sixth Amendment protection that you have a right to a speedy trial, is a civil right. And we can see that in another way, in the sense that even when that is assured on paper, when you had things like lynching, which is going out to say that we know someone is guilty just because a white woman is charged, an African American, with looking at her like that, you didn't have a speedy trial. It was just a mob that came in and decided to take vigilante justice against that individual. So the right to a speedy trial is a civil right. It is in the Bill of Rights. The more complicated one is the Second Amendment to the US Constitution. The Second Amendment to the US Constitution is one that has changed over time. As originally interpreted for most of our history, the Second Amendment is seen as a positive right, as a system of equality, and that is saying that for a well-regulated militia, the right to bear arms shall. And so in that sense, if you take the entire Second Amendment, and this is what the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled for a significant period of time until very recently, it is this argument that it is a civil right. It is something where the government has to come in and have a well-regulated militia, and that's why you have the right to bear arms. But the Second Amendment has, in its meaning, because the U.S. Supreme Court has changed its interpretation. In D.C. versus Heller, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a controversial 5-4 decision, has argued instead that there is an individual right to bear arms, not simply for a well-regulated militia. And so in that sense, there are ways in which something that started out as a civil right can then be changed into a civil liberty because of the interpretation that the U.S. Supreme Court has done. But with exception, which is worth thinking about and talking about and debating, to sort of lose the larger observation that if you take a look at the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, they are civil liberties, they are freedom, they are about negative rights. The only civil rights, the unambiguous civil rights that are protected in the Bill of Rights is the Sixth Amendment right to a speedy trial.